So I think I get the best position. I'm at the end, so you're all looking very tired. So I want everyone to get up. I'm about to do what I do best, which is teach a self-defense lesson right now. I know you're looking so tired. Smile. I need energy. Okay, I need one volunteer. Who's me? Come, whoever said me. Come. All right. So I'm going to teach you a quick self-defense class. Okay, there's a couple of things that you all need to know about any self-defense, thank you, any self-defense technique that you learn. The whole point of self-defense is that the goal is not to attack someone because you don't like them. The goal is to de-escalate a situation just so you can get out of the situation. I'm going to teach you something very quick. You're going to use the person standing next to you, and you're going to learn. So what's your name?
Daniela.
Daniela, right now, is going to be the person who's going to be attacking me. So the way she's attacking me is that she's just going to grab my hand. So do you have someone standing next to you that can grab your hand, grab your arm? So the automatic reaction when someone grabs your arm is that oftentimes you pull away, right? And you try to escape. But what does that make them do? It makes them hold on to you even tighter. And it actually makes it more difficult for you to then be released later on.
Am I still holding you?
Yeah, hold me tight.
Okay.
She's holding me tight. So what you're going to do, actually, the first thing is you're going to open your hand that's held. So you're opening it up because then it actually loosens their grip a little bit. Then you actually twist your hand, and you see the part where the thumb and the middle finger touch, you rip your hand out of that part. That's what you do. It's very easy. So you twist, and then you pull out. Okay. Oh, people don't see us. Come.
Oh, we're here.
Wait, are folks getting it? Do folks get it? Yes? Okay, we're gonna do it one more time. So I'm gonna grab her now. Now you have to do it. I'm grabbing her, and then she's gonna do it. Ready? And then twist. Yes, exactly. Good job. All right, thank you, Danielle. Okay, now everyone can sit down. I'm glad you have energy. Where's my clicker? It's hard to go last after 5 talks. So again, my name is Rana Abdelhamid, and I'm the founding president of the Women's Initiative for Self-Empowerment, or WISE, a self-defense, social entrepreneurship, and leadership organization for Muslim women. And today I'm going to make a case for empowerment spaces for women in order to be able to talk about how we could fight back against gender-based and anti-Muslim violence. And I just want to preface my talk in case anyone, just with a trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about both gender-based and anti-Muslim violence. In case you experienced any of these things in the past and you at any time need to leave the room, feel free to, and that's it. So when I was a young woman, when I was a young girl, I would sit next to my Egyptian mother on the floor in front of a long mirror and emulate the way she would wrap beautiful, bright silk around her head. To her, hijab was a sacred thing. Outside of the home, my mother would navigate foreign New York City streets, and oftentimes she'd be warding off xenophobia and mistreatment. One day, as we were walking down a New York City street, a white woman came up to us, looked at my mother, and said, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" My mother, in her calm demeanor, looked right back at her, with a thick accented response, said, "Ma'am, would you like some help with your bags?" When I got older, in order to kind of salvage my Egyptian Muslim identity and so that I wouldn't become too Americanized, my mother would ship my brother and I off for the summer to Egypt, to Alexandria, Egypt. And to us, going to Alexandria, Egypt was like going to Disneyland. Because if you've ever seen the difference between Jones Beach and the Mediterranean, it's a huge difference. And it was beautiful. We'd spend hours and hours on the boardwalk, listening to music, talking to our cousins, learning about our Egyptian heritage and culture. But at the same time, for the first time in my life, another part of my identity was highlighted. For the first time, I was being told that I couldn't do things because I was a woman. I couldn't sit in the cafe that was underneath our house with my brother and my male cousins because I was a woman. I couldn't leave the home at certain hours of the night because I was a woman. I couldn't go to the cyber that was down the street because I was a woman. And at the same time, I was introduced to stories of violence that were happening in my own family. I saw scars and bruises on my aunt's arm. I learned about female genital cutting. I experienced verbal harassment on the street. And it was an experience that shook me. While I was experiencing all these things, I watched every single day as my aunts and my cousins every day would fight against the patriarchy that they were facing, using lessons from their Islamic history and their culture, and their Egyptian history, from powerful women in Egyptian history, which was very moving to me, to the point that when I returned back to the United States, I actually got involved with the gender justice movement in New York City and started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter in New York. And for the first time, I realized that gender issues weren't just happening in the Middle East, they were actually happening right there in Queens. And New York is actually one of the places in the United States with the highest levels of gender-based violence. And so I was listening to these horrifying stories of violence, and then my religious identity was reintroduced and re-highlighted, because one day, I was 16 at the time, I was walking down the streets of New York on my way to this domestic violence shelter, and I was attacked. A man assaulted me and tried to remove my hijab. I remember turning around, being able to fight back, but then seeing hate in his eyes and understanding what hate could look like for the first time. I rushed off, locked myself in the bathroom of the shelter, and cried for hours, but didn't do anything. I didn't stand up for myself. I didn't report it. I didn't know who I could speak to. The issue of anti-Muslim violence wasn't being talked about 7 years ago, if you could think about it. And so really had no space. At the same time, I actually started to do research. And what I learned was, after 9/11, hate crimes against Muslims in the United States increased by 1,600%. So I realized that I was not alone in this, and that most of the hate crimes that were facing Muslim Americans were actually facing Muslim American women. 80% of these instances of violence were facing Muslim American women. And so I wasn't alone. So at the time, I had one skill, or I felt like I had one skill, and my Egyptian mother had put me in Shotokan karate classes since I was 7 years old, so I had a black belt in Shotokan karate. And so I was like, here's a skill that I could offer to my community. So I went out and started speaking to local imams and community members and tried to get them to give me a space to be able to teach self-defense to young Muslim women in our community. And at first, a lot of doors were shut in my face. Flyers were ripped up in my face. I was told there was enough programming for Muslim women in my community, which is obviously not true, because obviously. But I kept going back and ultimately was able to find really great allies among Muslim men, Arab men, non-Muslims, non-Arabs, women, and it really allowed me 4 months later to come to be in the basement of a community center in Brooklyn, which was 2 hours away from my house, with 13 young women around me. And for the first time, I shared my story publicly and told these young women my story. And after I said my story, all these young women began to share their own stories. And they told stories of gender-based violence, they shared stories of anti-Muslim violence, bullying, harassment, verbal harassment. And it really taught me, and it showed me that I was not alone in this experience. And for the first time in my life, I was 16, I felt confident and comfortable in my own skin in a space. For the first time in my life, I felt like it wasn't a paradox to be a Muslim and to be an American, to be an Arab and to be an American. And that was the most beautiful thing that could ever happen to me at that time. And so for 13 weeks, we kept meeting, and I kept teaching self-defense, and we kept talking about what it meant to live in America at that time with such hostile 9/11 sentiments. So obviously, this conversation isn't not relevant to what's going on in the world today, given the recent election results. But WISE today continues to run, and I don't do this on my own. It's actually the first 13 women and the many more women who started working with us who continue to put in hours and hours and time and time again to create the movement that we're creating. So today, WISE has trained upwards of 1,000 women across the US and Europe. We don't just teach self-defense, we teach self-defense, social entrepreneurship, and storytelling. And we really try to create a space where young women can come together and get the tools they need to propel themselves into leadership, to become leaders and change makers in their own world. And also, so I said, we're across the US and also do work in Europe. We've had tons of media features as well. But this summer was the first time that I actually brought this back to where my original introduction to gender issues happened. So I brought this back to the Middle East. So as many of you, I was very horrified by what was happening in Syria and very horrified by the Syrian civil conflict and wanted to do something. So I just started reaching out and started Googling what I can possibly do, because Google is my best friend, obviously, and was introduced to a ton of organizations and reached out to them and got a response back. And then one of them was like, okay, why don't you come and teach self-defense to Syrian refugees? And so I ended up in Jordan, packed my bags, was in Jordan for the summer, spent 3 months in Zatari refugee camp. The first month I was there, I was like, what the hell am I doing here? I'm this Harvard University student. My Arabic is not that cute. At the beginning, it wasn't. And I can leave whenever I want. I had this passport where many of the people that I was working with couldn't. They were stuck there. So I really felt my privilege kind of hover over me. But what ended up happening is I just spent time listening. I spent time drinking tea. I spent time learning Depka with the women. They tried to get me to tell them Egyptian jokes, but I wasn't that funny. And basically, they started to tell me their stories over that period of time. And I learned about a lot of the gender issues that they were dealing with as well. And so when I started the class, I started with 23 girls who were all 14, 15 years old. And during one of the first sessions, I asked them what their dreams were. And they told me that they wanted to become pilots, they wanted to become fashion designers, makeup artists, they wanted to become educators and doctors. And as they were sharing their dreams, one of the young women actually got really aggravated by my question and was like, why are you asking us this? It's not like we can achieve any of these things anyway. And as she was saying this, the other girls got really aggravated too, and they kind of all started to debate whether or not they could achieve these dreams. And their voices got louder, and one of the mothers that was standing outside walked into the room and started listening. And then she started talking, and she said, listen, my daughter is 14, and she pointed at her daughter, and she said, I pulled her out of school 2 years ago because she was unsafe in school. And I said, why did you pull her? Why was she unsafe? And she said, because one day as she was on her way to school, she experienced verbal harassment. And as a result of the verbal harassment, she came home crying and panicked. And we felt so fearful for her life and how she was so traumatized that we decided the best thing to do was pull her out of school. And as soon as the story was over, the other girls got really mad again, and they were like, this is not fair, even the men are against us and all of this. And basically, then they started to share other stories, and they started to talk about all these challenges that they were facing on a day-to-day level that had to do with gender-based violence. So it was early marriage, it was domestic violence in their homes, it was not being allowed to go to school because they were women and their brothers were going to school. And it reminded me so much of the conversation that we had in New York, the conversations I've had in Madrid, the conversations I had in Paris with women, regardless of the context, that they were dealing with these gender-based issues on a day-to-day level. So despite the fact that there was a macro issue of war, the challenges, I was so shocked that, I don't know if everyone else is shocked, the challenges that they were facing on a day-to-day still had to do with their gender. It was insane to me. I could not even believe it. It was so horrifying. But these women, there's a happy story at the end of this, is that they actually came together and they didn't just say, okay, this is our luck, this is horrible. What we did was we asked them, okay, what can you do? This is the reality, what can you do about this? And they actually came up with a campaign to raise awareness about the gender-based violence issues that they face in their communities. And they came up with this really badass photo campaign where they all wore black burqas so they could maintain anonymity, and they held up signs that said no to early marriage, no to domestic violence, no to street harassment. And these signs and images were put up in an oasis for UN Women that's frequented by 5,000 women a month. So all these women were seeing the messages of these 13 and 14-year-old girls, and this was resonating with them. So these girls came up with this campaign just because they were given the space to actually articulate their grievances and think about what are the things that are challenging them. So again, the safe space that we created here, just like the safe space that we created and the empowered space that we created in the US or in Europe, was allowing and giving these young women the tools to become their own change makers. It wasn't me telling them what to do. It was them coming to these conclusions because they were given the space to actually think about them and actually articulate them. And that's what we continue to do. So unfortunately, I mentioned the election. I hate to mention it because it's been so difficult. But since the Trump campaign, there has been such a rising wave of anti-Muslim sentiment. And many of the young Muslim women I work with have faced such horrifying instances of violence. In fact, 2 days ago, a young woman named Hind called me, and she was in her car. She was like, Rana, I can't take this anymore. I'm so terrified and so tired. I'm taking off my hijab. I don't want anything to do with my identity. I can't deal with this. And next to her in the car was a young woman named Anita, and she was her friend, a young woman that she had met through a WISE program. Anita was just punched in the face in Manhattan by a man who was angered by the fact that she was wearing the hijab because she was Muslim. And this young woman, Anita, didn't feel comfortable calling the police, and what she did was call Hind, her mentor through WISE. And for me, that was so powerful because when I experienced my hate crime, although obviously the situation is horrible, but when I experienced my hate crime, I had no one to call. I had no idea where to go. I had no resource. I had no one to pick me up. But here it was, a community that we've created for each other to hold each other in these times when times are so damn difficult. And this is what we're going to continue to do as times seem so rough. And I think the message that I want everyone to take away from this is that, sometimes times look really, really dark, and the world looks really, really dark. But there's always amazing things, and there's always such beautiful community that we could draw on and create. And so I ask you all, if you're interested in getting involved with our organization, if you're interested in learning how to create community spaces and safe spaces, so feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to engage. But thank you so much for engaging in my funny self-defense lesson and also listening to my talk.